And good morning. Welcome to the feature focus of Shared Labs. My name is Brian Bork, and I am here with the Indemnable. Now, I can't think of a better name. My name is Brian Bork. I am a Senior Solutions Engineer for Learn On Demand Systems, and I am joined by James Burnham, who is... What do you do,
I am
James?
the Content Team Manager for Learn On Demand Systems.
What does that mean?
That means that I am in charge of our actual content development, which means when customers give us content that they'd like to host so that way they can run courses and classes, we put that together, we stand it up so that customers can actually run that class.
Perfect. So what does my Senior Solutions Engineer mean?
That's a great question, Brian.
You have no idea, and nor do I, no. And I'm primarily responsible for making sure that our customers have what they need in order to be able to build labs and do what they need to do. So we're going to focus, and as the instruction or the name of this session dictates, we're going to focus on shared labs. And it is a feature inside of Learn On Demand Systems. So if we take a look at the slides, it's this introductory slide just covers what we're going to talk about. But what we're really talking about is our shared lab environment. And a shared lab environment is actually two or more components. And as you can see here, the basis of the concept behind the shared labs is for students to work together or against each other towards a goal. And that goal might be to get to a particular machine on the inside, or it might be to work against each other. So if you and I were participating in this, your virtual machine would be attacking my virtual machine, and I'm trying to defend. There are all sorts of concepts behind this. And as you can see on the slide that's in the background, we have a lot of different topics, a lot of different possibilities to talk about. So I am going to talk about cyber range exclusively, but I want to talk about some of these other possibilities. So one thing that a shared lab environment is really good for is to give you the ability to be able to put information into a central location and then have multiple types of participants or multiple types of students with all different capabilities be able to do things in the central area. So one area that I always refer to as an example is if you are teaching a class that has something to do with Active Directory domains, and you want to be able to make sure that students are able to join a domain. Well, it doesn't make sense for every person to have their own domain controller because that's not real world. I mean, if we're talking about Active Directory federated services, maybe that's a real world, and we'll talk about that in a second. But a domain join is more personal. You are working inside of a actual environment where you're joining a domain. So you put the domain in the center, and then you give people machines that are available to them and sysprepped so that they can join that domain and then become a member of the domain and do all of the stuff that they need to do. So have you ever joined a domain?
I have.
Okay.
And that's exactly how it would work in a real workplace. You'd have the shared environment, like you're referring to, would be your corporate headquarters and their actual servers. And as a student, you'd get your individual virtual machine, which is the same as your personal computer, and then you join that into the network domain.
Exactly. And if you want to show people how easy that is to do, this is a great way of being able to do that.
Yes.
In sort of relation to that, both Exchange On-Prem and SharePoint are a perfect example, and in some cases, even better examples, because they rely on collaboration. SharePoint, and of course, we could also talk about Skype for Business and any sort of online communication technology, whether it be Discord or Slack or any of that kind of stuff, where you have a central server where people are going to need to connect into that server, and you want them to be able to share information. So Exchange On-Prem and SharePoint are both good examples. Now, I mentioned Active Directory Federated Services, or ADFS, and this is, a lot of people think it needs to be a single participant, like you've got a Windows 10 virtual machine, and that is your participant that's joining in the shared space. But what if you have your own domain that you control with member servers and clients and a domain controller, DNS servers, and then you are wanting to federate with a different Active Directory domain. You could do that as an example. And I think where we run into problems is that people have a tendency to think small when it comes to this. Now, we're going to show you some small examples, but imagine the scalability.
Yeah.
You don't have to just give somebody one machine. You can give them multiple domains and things like that. The last thing on my list here is Windows 10 deployments. And the reason I bring this one up is because we've actually had a customer case where this came up, and you have all of the infrastructure that's needed in order to deploy Windows 10. Well, what if that was a central location and then you had sort of blank machines that were just sort of bare metal that started up and connected and joined? So this can be a really good example of beginning to end. Here's what it looks like. And you can even do the captures and all that other kind of stuff. So
a way I like to think about it, Brian, is your shared environment is really a company intranet, or you can even think of it as the actual internet, where it connects all of your other systems.
Right.
So using ADFS, for example, where you may have multiple machines, you may have 5, 6, 7 machines that you need to connect into other machines. You can do that client to client, or you can even do that client to the host server. So you're connecting out to the internet, or you're just using that internet or intranet and connecting into another client. So it's a great way to really think about it, is just that shared environment is either your intranet or internet, and you have personal clients or personal headquarters for each student.
Right. But you don't want to think about it in the sense of, I've got my own SharePoint server, you've got your own SharePoint server. So when I post things, I have to log on as a different user to see that, oh, look, I posted to SharePoint. Whereas if we're working together, I can post something on our central SharePoint, and you will be able to see it because you're a participant in that environment. So really the concept behind your shared lab environment is anytime you want a central machine or group of machines and then have participants that use that central core. And we use core, we use host, we use instructor environment. All of those terms really mean shared lab environment. Okay? So let's talk about cyber range possibilities, because a lot of times shared labs are almost always equated with cyber range. And quite honestly, cyber range is a huge buzzword. Do you know what a cyber range is?
I do. It's a huge thing, especially anyone who contracts out to the military. The military loves cyber ranges right now, so it's big in information security sector. It's where you have two sets of users trying to attack or defend, depending on the user, a central client.
Right.
So think of it, our government likes to use it, replicate, for example, the DoD. One group is going to be the DoD defenders, the other group's going to be the DoD attackers, and get at each other and see if they can break in.
Right. So let's take a look at some possibilities. So there is the all attack core. So you have a core environment, whether it's a single machine or multiple machines, inside the center, and then you have all the participants attempting to attack that. The first one to get in wins. Sort of, we call it capture the flag. The first one to get in wins, and then you reset the environment and start over. That's a possibility. The other one is, what if the center in 30 minutes is going to run a script? 30 minutes from launch, it's going to run a script. Or perhaps the person who's controlling that center is going to launch an attack. So you have 30 minutes to get yourself ready, and then you're going to have to defend against their attack. Or the attack is happening, now you have to defend against it and make changes to it. It's so weird. I get all worked up about this because the possibilities with cyber range are really limitless. They're really however you want to do it. So let's look at a couple more advanced examples. What if James and I want to attack James, and James is supposed to defend? Well, that's perfect. That's a great situation. The difference here is we have somebody keeping track of what we're doing to each other, and then we can say, all right, Brian successfully attacked, or James successfully defended. So you could actually have two different kinds of participants in it. You can have a red team and a blue team, and then the center is actually the scoring mechanism or keeping track or a recorder of what's going on.
Oh, Brian, real quick on that note, So we can have a red and a blue team, but what if we wanted to have a third team, like a green team? Can we do that?
Absolutely. You can have as many different kinds of participants. So let's give an example. You could do a Windows 10 participant and a Kali Linux participant and a Windows Server participant. And each one of those, let's say the Windows 10 is red, the Kali Linux is blue, and the server is green. Each one of those teams or participants can be assigned, and you can say, all right, that we're going to have student A is doing 1, student B is doing 2, and just you can have multiple participants. They're all either attacking that core, defending a core, or they're attacking and defending each other, and the core is recording that. So that's an excellent question, and that's an excellent way of being able to do it. And again, I'm struggling to come up with ways of being able to do this, but there are so many possibilities.
Yeah, and that's why it's hard to come up with concepts. It's hard to think of things we can't do with it.
Exactly correct. So there are possibilities within that concept of having multiple types of participants. What if you get a higher score if you use a command line only version of Linux as opposed to using the full GUI of Windows? You give somebody a little bit more credit towards this because they used one participant or the other participant, and you let the students choose which participant they want to use. And I put down at the bottom of the slide, and many more, which typically is just a way of ending a slide. But really, in this case, it's 100% true. You could do, the sky is literally the limit.
If you can think of it, we could probably make it happen.
That's right. So I want to talk a little bit about one of our customers, and I don't have a slide or anything like that about this, but I do want to give sort of a description of what the customer wanted to do and how we address that. The customer wanted to train their employees, their groups, their teams, and they wanted to train them about security. So they developed a core environment and then gave the students 2 different types of participants and then tried to see how those participants went. And they actually set up a scenario where they were 2 different teams. One team was attempting to hack and obtain a specific target, which was a list of, I can't remember what the actual thing was, but it was like a list. And then the attackers, that was their job, was to obtain that list. And the defenders were trying to do anything they could to make it so that that list didn't get out. And in the end, I think the attackers won.
The attackers did win, yeah.
And not only did they win, they got more than just the list. They got in there and like recorded IP addresses and all that other kind of stuff. But here's the real important part about that. None of that was managed. You didn't have to set up any labs. You didn't have to configure anything. A student could participate in their own time. And if their team member happened to be online at that time, they could join in, or you could do it all by yourself. And it's that type of interactivity is something that only shared labs brings you.
Yeah, it was really great because that took place over, I think, about 2 weeks.
Yes.
And it was literally the participants in their free time, whenever they had time, they logged in and made their attempts at attacking or beefed up the defenses, whatever their role was. And then once their free time was done, they, went back to doing work or whatever it was they had to do.
Right.
And yeah,
it did make it an excellent example. And we're looking for success stories out there. So if you've got an idea for, I'd like to make a lab that uses cyber range or that uses a shared lab, I want to build a cyber range using shared lab, by all means, feel free to contact us. That's part of my job, is to make sure that you have the tools, and it's part of James' job to make sure that the tools work properly.
Yes.
So what actually goes into doing a shared lab? And this is the part of this that boggles my mind, is that it's not complicated. It's a couple of checkboxes. Now, they're important checkboxes. I will make that statement. But you have to theorize. And so we're going to do a little bit of theory crafting here. We're going to talk about what ifs and talk about what type of scenarios you need to do. And one of the things that's really important is you have to think about this ahead of time, is how are your participants going to participate? Meaning, are they going to use IP addressing? If so, are you going to assign those IP addresses as you as an instructor or you as a developer of this lab? Are you going to tell the student to how to assign that IP address, or are you going to have them automatically obtain IP addresses? Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, because each participant is spinning up their own lab profile, which is our term, or virtual machine, or virtual machines, or web space, or whatever they're spinning up. But that space is theirs. But every single participant is launching that same space. So if every single one starts off with a statically assigned address, they're all starting off with the same address. Now, you can change that, and that can actually be part of your instructions, and let's get you set up. Or you could actually script it. You could set it up so that it changes your IP address. But an easier way to do it is to make sure your core environment, that is the network that they're going to participate on, has a DHCP server, and that your clients are set to DHCP. That's why it's the first thing on the list. Now, that isn't a requirement, but it is certainly a good idea. And what we've discovered is a lot of people who don't put DHCP in find they have to put in a lot of explanation about how do I do this, or here's how you put this step in place. So putting that in place is something to think about. Next thing you want to think about is, does the participant just want to get to the shared lab space, or does it want to get beyond? And if it wants to get beyond, meaning like out to the internet or to Azure or something like that, if their goal is to get beyond, then how do they get beyond? Are they going to just have direct internet access on their machine? Or are they going to have direct, internet access, but only if they successfully complete something and then actually get through? So I could see a form of attack, for instance, where you're trying to get your environment set up so that you use the core environment to get out to the internet. So maybe you throw a router in place, or you could put in a pfSense router, or you might use a Windows machine as a router. Any of those environments are possible, but you have to think about, how do I want them to do this? Because a lot of times, especially when it comes to cyber range stuff, you don't want the participants having a bunch of tools that are, let's say, less than favorable, going out to the internet and maybe doing real attacks.
Yeah, that can be very dangerous. That's a very important thing to think about when you're allocating internet access. You definitely need to think of what your users have access to on that virtual machine.
Yes, exactly. So making sure that you have internet access available if you want it available, because they need to get tools, but make it very controlled. As a matter of fact, we are in the process of building our own cyber range, learn on demand systems. And one of the things that we had to put in place was we had a router to router communication where you've got a configured interface where you're routing information between your multiple machines, but that router is then connected to a central router, which lets you go out and report to scoring servers and go out to get information, but it does not let you go through to web browse or FTP or any of that kind of stuff. So you have to configure that on your side. Again, anything you can want to do, you can do, but you do have to put the configuration in place. Domain controller. Well, now, obviously, if you're teaching Linux, you don't necessarily need to have a domain controller. No. But if you're doing any of the Active Directory domain stuff, you may want to have a domain controller. There are a couple of things to keep in mind with domain controllers and members. Because your participants are typically spinning up things, you don't want to start them as member servers or members of a domain. You want to have them do that as part of your exercise in order to show them, how that process works, and also to make sure that you're not running into any difficulty with name conflicts or naming conflicts or SID conflicts or MAC address conflicts. And again, remember that LDAP and AD domains, complete with routers, you can give the participants their own domain. And that way you don't have to worry about joining it to another domain unless you're going to be doing some of that federated services stuff. I'm trying to think of the more complicated types of shared labs. Other than the fact that, when you get into cyber ranges, you could be talking about dozens of machines because you've got, a rich, complex central core. And then you may have, I've got a Windows machine, I've got a Linux machine, I've got a Mac OS, and I want to use those all to attack that machine or that group of machines. But what am I forgetting? Am I forgetting any other types of activities that you might be able to do?
I don't think so. I think one thing that's important to point out is just kind of going back to domains real quick. It is possible to have multiple domains within a shared lab environment.
Right.
So, for example, if you're doing a cyber range and you have a red team and a blue team, your red team, you may want to be on their own domain, whereas the blue team that's defending needs to be on their own domain that's part of that shared lab environment. So if your red team's trying to infiltrate that shared lab, they can all communicate against or along with each other, while the blue team can communicate with each other and the shared lab environment. Or maybe the shared lab is on a completely separate network. It's a completely off-site thing. And then you've got blue team and red team both on their own domains.
Mm-hmm.
All of that can be done just by adding multiple domain controllers to that shared lab environment and pointing the proper participants to the proper domain controllers.
Absolutely. And the important part to remember is that you don't want to look at it as setup for the end user, because students don't like spending a bunch of time getting an environment ready. They want to have that environment pre-configured. They click the launch button, it comes up and runs, which is what we're going to show you here in just a couple of minutes when we do the how-to part of this. But you've got to balance their desire to have something very simple and set up with the desire to show them actual technologies that are in place. So, for example, setting up a domain join is something that's very important to the end user. You want to show them that. But if it's not part of your learning process, then you need to have that done for them, and you have to figure out how to script that. One thing on the slide that I didn't really stress that I really want to bring to the foreground is anything that you can put into a single lab profile can be put into a shared lab environment or a participant. Absolutely. And that is a good lead in to what we're actually going to do as far as the demonstration goes. So let me switch to my environment here. So what I have here is I have two different lab profiles. Now, if you're not familiar with what a lab profile is, we'll be doing some recapping on this in tomorrow when we're talking about everything you need to know about
that's changed in LOD.
Yeah, everything that's changed in LOD, but we'll be referring back to some of the correct technology. But in this particular case, what we have is what I call the shared labs environment. Now, this happens to be a Windows 2016 server, and it's just a file server, and it's got IIS installed. That's all it is. So let's take a look at this. And again, this is a single lab profile with a single virtual machine. Remember that this lab profile could have multiple virtual machines in it that all are interacting and composed. In this particular case, we're just keeping it simple for the purposes of demonstration. So let me bring this one up. There we go. So this is the SLE server. That's how I recognize it. I keep the information on here. And the base component that I wanted to show here is, as an example, is my File Explorer. And it's always fun to have to scroll like this. Let me reduce my zoom for just a second. What is it, Shift?
Control.
Control, thanks. That's just doing it inside. That's what I wanted. Okay, so the text may get a little bit tiny here, but it'll make it a little bit easier for me to show. So as you can see, this machine is on a network by itself. It doesn't have anything else. We have a single machine listed over here. And inside of my all files, I've got a set of shares set up, both an NFS set of shares and SMB set of shares. Now, again, I could show you that IIS is installed, but you'll have to trust me. It's there. All right, so that's what this is. It's a single lab. And I clicked on launch, and I got a single virtual machine that's inside of that single lab. Now, this is going to be the core. This is going to be the environment where multiple participants are going to be able to connect to it. So I'm going to cancel this so that I can actually show you the editing. And I'm going to switch over to the participant. Now, the participant is a separate lab profile. It is a single Windows 10 VM, and it is, I still have my, there we go. It is its own environment. It's on its own network. It's all present. And again, this is something that you may take from an existing lab that you already have, that you work with every day, and now you just want to make it a component. And you can see here in this network, it only sees itself. So what if we want to make this the machine that you get and I get and this door gets? I didn't want to mention that Robert is sitting in the room watching us. So, but
well, no, you did. It's
now
too
I
late.
did. Yes.
Cat's out of the bag.
It's his flip flops that's really doing it. So, but I wanted to mention specifically that again, this is very simple. But you could have dozens of virtual machines in here that are part of a single lab profile that you want to share out, or you can say, all right, I want to, and again, we can talk about this when we talk about making making better labs more quickly tomorrow. And that won't be you and I think
that is you and Robert.
That me and Robert. Exactly. See, you have one job and you did it right. That's from the keynote from this morning, if you didn't pay attention. All right. So we've got this environment. It's a very simple environment. It could be much more complex, but let me get rid of this lab. And so now I want to show you the actual process of taking a single shared lab set of labs or a set of labs, because each one is its own lab profile. We got our server, we got our client. We're going to talk about how you actually make them into a shared lab.
So that we can access those file shares that we saw.
We can access those file shares from the participant. We're going to link them together. So how do we link them together? Well, it's actually pretty easy. So let's take a look here. If I go in and edit my profile, the actual way of linking these together is under the Advanced tab. Now, it's a good time to mention that you may not have access to this, because this is all protected with permissions. So it's important to note that you can contact our help desk team or our support team or our content team, and we will be able to get you access to be able to build your own shared labs. But we have to make sure that we are kind of giving this out to people who actually want to build them, and not setting up an environment where you get anonymous launches and bad things going out to bad people.
And the reason for that is, it's not that we don't trust people to make shared labs. It's that we don't want someone to accidentally activate that feature and then they make a shared lab and don't realize what it is and have a lab that doesn't function.
Exactly. Because, and why there's a slide on this later, everything changes once you make a shared lab. Yes. So a perfect example, this is actually really good to stress right now, is that if I go to my shared lab, you'll notice that I've got my launch button right up here below my status. I should probably refresh this so it doesn't say canceled. You see I've got a launch button here under not running. When I change this into a shared lab, that launch button goes away. Mm-hmm. And that's where people start freaking out a little bit, because they're like, all right, I turned it into a shared lab, but now how do I launch it? We're going to talk about that as our last part of this. So let me go back in and edit my profile. You don't have to do anything special to the lab except for two things. You go over to the Advanced tab, and if you have the appropriate permissions... Oh, wait. I don't have the appropriate permissions. I wonder why that is. Well, actually, I did this on purpose because Brian Developer, the account that I'm using, doesn't actually have that. So I've got another lab or another interface up here, and I'm going to make it possible for myself to be able to have these permissions. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is, if you go in trying to do a shared lab and you want to do something that you don't have access to, that's when it's an important thing to contact our team. Our team will then be able to go in and be able to find your user account. Are you going to beat me to it? James is going to do it. I want to show you what the screen looks like here. Actually, I don't even need to show you what the screen looks like, because we would do it behind the scenes.
So just like in your real environment would, Brian has no access to this right now. So myself being part of our support team or our content team, after you contact us, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give him permissions to do this. Now, Brian, you should have permissions, so go ahead and log out and log back in.
Yep. I'm doing that right now. And if I refresh this and go into edit my profile and go to advanced, now, there it is, the shared class environment. And it's, again, showing a feature that we put security in so that you don't have access to things. And quite rightly so, you don't see things that you don't have access to because, again, you turn this on and then suddenly your lab launch button disappears and you don't know how to get to your lab. We want to make sure that we're helping you. And Corey talked about self-service. We want to get to the point where you can turn this on for yourself, Absolutely. But that you have an understanding about what you're doing when you do it. So this is step one of making a shared lab. You go to shared class environment, you do the down arrow, and you have the choice of doing a shared environment or a participant. We're going to select shared environment. Is it really just that? No, there's one more step, and this is the one that people sometimes forget, and that is that you need to go over to your networks, and you need to determine what network is going to be shared, because quite honestly, that's the key to shared labs. We are sharing a network space between the virtual machines, not a physical space or not a memory space. It's all about the networking. So in this particular case, I don't need the external because that's not important to what we're doing here. We're trying to view the IIS server and the file share. So I am going to uncheck my external and leave my shared class network checkbox for the one environment, which is the private environment or the private network interface. All right, and that's it. I click on save. Now, once I've done this, and I would normally give a description, but I'm not going to because it's not a lot of fun to sit there and watch me type. But I want you to see that this now still has a launch button. The launch button didn't disappear, but this is what happens when you click on launch. Wait a second. Access denied, or even if it was access granted, it would say you have to launch this in the context of a class. So it's important to remember that once you turn things into a shared lab, it changes a little bit. And we'll talk about those changes as soon as I set up the participant. All right. So this is just the shared core, or we call it the shared lab environment, but it might be also referred to as the instructor environment because in the context of a class, which you'll see me create in just a few minutes, your instructor is the one who typically launches this environment, although it does launch automatically if your instructor does not launch it for you. So let me switch over, and I'm just going to refresh my page here, and hopefully my permissions are going to be there. Let me just double check. Yep, there it is. So now I'm editing the participant. Again, I just go to the Advanced tab, but now, because it's called a participant, I think you can probably guess which one you're going to use. Participant. So you click on participant, but now you've got to choose what this is going to participate in. So you want to make sure that you're selecting the shared lab environment that this participant is going to take place with, or is going to be used with. But the real cool thing is that you're not limited to this. You could make multiple different lab profiles, different participants of the same shared lab space. And that's how you get a Kali Linux box, a Windows box, a server box, and so on.
Yep, absolutely.
Maybe not a Mac OS. I mentioned that earlier, and I really was thinking about that, and I was like, no, maybe not a Mac OS. All right, so now when I do a search here, you'll notice that we get a lot of criteria in here, but when I do a search, only one result comes up. That's because of the search criteria that gets put in place. This is really important that you typically want these to be in the same lab series. It's not a requirement, but it's a lot harder to find if it isn't within the same lab series. And that you should be doing that anyway. So
yeah, because a lab series is designed to keep all of your labs that should be together.
That's right. So. A lot of people ask us, they're like, why do we have lab series and lab profiles? And I always equate the lab series to the cover of the book.
Yes.
And then the lab profiles are like the chapter of the book. So that cover of that book is really important, not just because you identify it, not just because it has a name, but because it contains everything that's inside of the book. So here I am. I've selected this. I click on OK, and now my participant is a part of my shared labs. Well, almost. Got one more step I got to do, and this is an important step, just like it was with the shared lab environment, to go and check the box for the shared lab network. But if you go under networks, you'll notice that I have here a participant network. It's fine. I can leave that participant network in place, but I want my virtual machine to actually be connected to my shared lab network. So I go into the virtual...
So Brian, why do we have a participant network if we already had the shared network?
That's an excellent question. What if you're setting up your Windows 10 machine and you need it to be online for the setup, but you don't want it to be online for when it's actually participating in the shared lab? You can leave that network in place. And if you're wondering why I'm smiling, it's because Corey's outside making faces at us. You can't see him on the camera, but he is there. Anyway, you'll notice that my network adapter is listed up here to the participant network. If that was an online network, that's fine, but I don't want that to be part of my actual shared lab. So in order to participate in my shared lab, you'll notice that I have that private network, which was shared. Even though, if I go back to my networks here, you'll see that there's only one network here, and it's called participant network. I still have two network choices. That's what the shared lab gives you, is those two choices. So that's how that all ties together. And so we change this to the private network, and we save it, and click on OK. And again, you notice that we get the banner across the top. We have a launch button, but again, if we click on that launch button, it gets confusing because we get an access denied. But it says, hey, this can only be launched in... The banner across the top says, hey, this can only be launched in the context of a class. Now, classes are kind of difficult to explain to lab developers because lab developers don't often work in the context of a class. We typically design labs in LOD, or the Lab on Demand environment, and those labs are then turned into courses either through API, LTI, or the kind of ultimate of APIs, our TMS, or Training Management System. But this is different. We actually have the ability in LOD, especially for lab developers, to be able to create a class. Now, I don't want to get kind of caught up in the details, so I'm actually going to switch over to a different account that I have that's available to set up a class, and then I'll show you what that class looks like. So this right here is what the create class interface looks like. And again, with your correct permissions, you will be able to create and attend classes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to make it into an instance of this lab, which links these two together. But it does it in a very interesting way, and we want to talk about that way because I know at some point James is going to ask the question. He's going to say, but Brian, how do I launch this environment? And so we're going to talk about how we do that. So let's give this a very, very descriptive name. Nope, it's not DevOps slide deck. Sorry. We're going to call this the Launch 2018 Shared Lab class. That should be pretty good.
That makes sense.
Yep. And the other thing that I'm going to do is make sure that it's part of the correct organization. And we're going to call this Launch. You'll notice that a lot of my automatic fill-ins are there. So now I have the name of the class. I have the organization so that it's under the correct organization so that if possible, I can give people links to it and then they'll be able to attend. I am going to set up the instructor for this to be myself, and this account is... Oops. I have too many accounts. And I also have to set a start and end time. So we're going to do, today is March 27th, and we're going to start this at, 10 a.m. And the end time is the 27th at, we'll say 5 p.m. Now, it is possible to set this up and have this be available for multiple days, and we're going to talk about why that's important when we talk about how you launch this environment. But I just have a couple more fields to fill in. And then a very important thing is, even though this setting allows me to set it, it is very important never to leave this set to unlimited, because you'll actually get an error message that comes up and says it can't be unlimited. And we've talked to the dev team, and we wanted to get that removed, but it is necessary for certain events to have that in place. So that's the reason why it's there. But we normally set this for a very small number because we only have a few people going in. So that's actually the setup of the class. And again, as a lab developer, this is something you don't typically do, but it is something you have to do with shared labs. And then I'm going to set available labs. And here is the first part that seems sort of counterintuitive. You would think, because we're linking together two labs, I have to put both of these labs in here. But because they're linked, we only have to put one of them in. Which one?
Participant.
You only put the participant in, exactly. So I'm going to click on Add Lab Profile, and I'm going to put this under Launch 2018. Actually, it's just under Launch. And search. And I've got to find my... There we go. So I have two different ones. I've got my shared lab environment and I have my participant. And of course, I could have done a search where it was only a participant and things like that, but I just listed them all. So I'm going to click on this one in particular, and it's just the participant. I'm going to click on OK, and you see that the available lab is just the participant.
Now, why don't we put the environment in there?
That's an excellent question, and it's because the way this connects in the class. So when I click on save, you'll see that my class has a couple of possibilities. One is the attend, and then I've also got the ability to monitor. So let's go ahead and attend this class virtually. And I'm doing this as me, as my developer account, not as Brian, developer that we were using earlier. But notice that it has the participant listed right here. That's the launch button that the student or participant gets. But then we got this little tiny rocket right up here. And that little tiny rocket is designed to give you a ability to launch that shared environment ahead of the class. So you as an instructor or you as the person who is running this event could get this shared environment up and running, and then the participants can join as needed.
Now, why would I have to do it ahead of time? Why would I have to set this environment up ahead of time? Since you already said a little earlier, launching a participant is going to launch that shared environment.
That's exactly correct. And the only reason you would do that is if you had specific services or things like that that did not start automatically and you had to get them preset. We have some customers out there who have taken, especially when it comes to scoring, they have moved the scoring outside of the lab environment because they don't want to have, they want to reuse that environment or keep track of things. And remember that when this lab is done, it's all going to be torn down. So they want to keep that environment running out in the real world. So what they do is they have that central core report out to the outside world. And so if you want to get that set up, you need to get that connection set up ahead of time. But in all honesty, when I click on this launch button, the beauty of this system is that, let's say it's after class and a student wants to practice some hacking or they want to just, test things out. They click on the launch button. It goes, hey, do I have this environment, the shared lab environment already running? Nope. All right, I'm going to spin one up. So that student's working away and doing their thing. And now another student wakes up and goes, hey, I want to do this too. So they click on their launch button. It's going to say, is this already running? Yes, it is. Here you can connect right into that environment. So you can do it either way. But that's an excellent question. And it's one of the things that confuses our lab developers a little bit is, well, why don't I link both of these? Because you only need the participant, because that's what gives you the launch button. But do I have to launch this environment ahead of time? No, you don't. I'm going to, as an example, but it is something that you don't have to do. So I'm going to click on this link here, and you'll notice that it gives me a launching lab. I'm not actually going to stay in this lab because I don't need to. I know that this server is going to start up and it's going to run. So James, why don't you go ahead and find that class and launch, and I'll launch as a student, and then we'll be able to see through the monitoring the ability to do that. Now, the key to this is that you have to make sure that all your networking services are set up. DNS is obviously very important. DHCP is very important. In my particular case, I don't know if my environment is going to be giving out an IP address, or if I'm going to have to make sure that I'm on the right network, if it's set statically. I didn't check any of that, so I'm hoping that I'm good. I'm saying that as a lab developer. I forgot to check. I know that it's set, but that's just me. So the environment. Oops. Did I bet you the because I just spun this up, it probably didn't cache out. So I had it ready earlier. I've got another class that I can use as an example. So let me just get that real quick. But the interesting thing about these shared labs is that, again, you don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a in-person event. It can be something where you do all of the instructions with the things that we're going to be talking about, IDLX, and how you configure those instructions. You can put all of that in place around it with videos and so on, and not have to worry about actually being present in front of the student because the environment launches automatically. So it is a really, really cool environment that gives you the capability of being able to do that. So let me just see here.
I just wanted to mention that, Brian, you noted the caching.
Yep.
So when you build a lab environment, so when you built that shared lab environment and then the shared lab participant separate, when you're building a lab environment, it's going to one of our data centers for you to build that.
Right.
So what happened in Brian's case is he built one environment in one data center and another environment in a different data center. Then he linked them together. So our servers still need to cache them across those different servers before they can actually communicate. Because when we're doing these shared labs, in order for them to all be on the same network, they all need to be on the same host. So you can't really communicate flawlessly cross globe like that. So that's why that happened there.
Right. So it thinks that it's able to run on multiple machines, but it really isn't able to run on multiple machines.
So it will be, just not right this moment.
Right. So let me just go back here. I'm just trying to find my extra shared class, and I think I'm doing it in the wrong browser. No, there it is. Hold on 2 seconds. And the now I can't find my shared lab. My shared class that available now. This isn't the correct one.
This one here, bro?
Yes, that's the one.
192.443.
192.443. 192?
Yes.
There we go. That's the one I was looking for. All right. So this has the exact same machines, only they were cached out. So I'm going to make sure that I don't have any other ones open, and I'm going to go ahead and build this. And that environment is being built, and then make sure that this comes up. And while this is coming up in the background, I'll go ahead and minimize that. But there are a couple of other things to talk about when it comes to the shared lab environment. Oh, my automatic screen going up confuses people. There's a couple of things to talk about because it's a class, and because this environment means that it is something that is being launched together. It sometimes doesn't necessarily make sense unless both things are running. So in this particular case, I could have a server running independently, or I could have the Windows 10 running independently, but getting them to talk together, it doesn't do anything unless you put them in the context of this class. So while this is going, getting started, I'm going to go ahead and do a monitor. And when I do the monitor, you will notice that I have 3 things that are starting up. And only one of them is under my name, and one is under yours. And then we have this one under system automation. And the reason that that's called that is because even if I launch it myself by clicking on the link, it's still a automatic process. It's still something that the system is doing. But if I had launched my lab environment without doing that, it still would have come up with that exact same message that the system automation was running.
Well, and Brian, this is a different class. So we did launch our labs without launching the shared environment first.
That's correct.
So the shared environment launched all on its own here.
That's
we
right.
did not initiate that.
And it will continue to run. That shared environment will continue to run even if the students disconnect so that other students could connect in until the timer runs out. So that's an important consideration to make. How long do I want this system to be available? Now you'll notice here that our 2 clients are starting to show as actually there and connected, and the other one still hasn't refreshed yet to show that the server's up, because the server takes a little bit longer to get up and running. Now, the goal here is to try to get the client, which is its own machine, to be able to connect to the server without having to really do anything fancy or change anything. So let's make sure that our environment is here, and you can see that my lab is up, the system automation lab is up. But let me just bring up my personal lab, and I'll go ahead and sign in.
Just resume there, Brian.
What's that?
Gotta just resume there again.
Oh, that's right. I want to make sure that I get rid of my scroll bars. There, almost there. There we go. So here is my lab environment. Now, one thing that's important to note is I do need to check my networking here, because again, this is something you don't necessarily think about when it's an independent lab. So if I wanted to be able to, connect to the shared lab space, and I want to be able to connect to the shares that we talked about that were on here, the SMB shares or the NFS shares, I have to make sure that my networking matches the networking of the machine. So if I take a look here at my Ethernet and look at the details, you will notice that I'm at 172.16.0.50. Well, is that going to match with what I have inside of my server? Well, I'm going to hope it does, but let me go ahead and bring this up here and look at our network. And again, we're doing this for just the file share. If you want to go ahead and bring up yours as well. James is inside of his lab, and I'm inside of my lab. And if I go to the SLE server, even though this only has one machine listed, I can see the SMB shares. Now, I could see the NFS shares if I were using NFS. And again, that could be part of the exercise. We install NFS on the client, and we connect to the shares, and we manipulate the shares and things like that. So if I go into this SMB1 and put in a new text file saying Brian is great, and if James and I were doing sort of a contest of who got here first, I might have won because I got my text document in here. James is experiencing something that is, actually, I can show you what he's experiencing. And this is something, again, that you get with using a class. I can actually go in and take a look at what James is doing.
So, Brian, what you'll see is my computer is not connected to the network.
And why do you think that is?
But I launched the same lab you did.
You did.
So why did I not connect?
And the answer to that question is that your environment actually spun up and got its network information before the server was up and recognized what it is. Or the other possibility is we have the exact same IP address.
Well, how would that happen?
Because I set the IP addresses statically.
You set it statically. So if I go to my network information...
And we were watching while you do that, by the way.
Yep. So remember, Brian showed his IP address as 172.16.0.50. And we see here my IP address is also 172.16.0.50. So we have a conflict.
That's right.
I would have to manually change that. I'm going to change that to a .51, and I'm going to accept that change. I'm just going to reset my network adapter just to make sure it goes through.
Because it isn't actually unplugged. Although Windows often thinks that things are unplugged.
Yes.
And you may actually have to reset the machine in order to get that to take, because sometimes the network
because
interface
Windows.
got locked down because of the IP address conflict. But the whole point, and I swear to God, I did this on purpose. This was not an accident. The whole reason I did this is because when you sign things statically and try to reuse that content, you have to be very, very mindful of what that's going to mean. So in this particular case, James and I both had the same IP address. That's where that case for DHCP really is going to come in handy. Although it looks like your network interface is still misbehaving. So at this point, we have a functional shared lab environment. Now, James and I could sort of banter back and forth, and he could change my Brian is great into a James is better and things like that. But the key to this is that you have this shared environment where you can move things back and forth and do things independently or working in cooperation or working against. So, maybe he goes into the server and does some remote commands that actually disable or put a firewall rule in, blocking my connection but allowing his connection to go through. There's all sorts of functionality and capability that are there. So I think if we take a look at the slides, yes, we should have probably looked at this slide before I showed this. The first thing on there is try to attain an IP address automatically unless you're going to script. Don't join to the domain. Using sysprep is always a good move on a Windows machine. It's not required necessarily for Linux. Remember, a single machine or multiple OSs, multiple versions, a full domain of machines, a match of whatever you need. Identify what the student needs to do the task. It doesn't matter what they need, just give it to them. And even if it's something where it's like, well, I don't know if they're going to need this, but I want them to have the tool, give them a machine. These don't have to be huge machines, especially when you're doing things like attack. They could be fairly small. All right, remember, once you turn on Shared Lab, the things start to get a little bit more complicated, and you have to put it in the form of a class. Once you put it in the form of a class, it should come up and be available. And on the slide, you can see our email address. I'm going to say it out loud. It is support@learnondemandsystems.com. 24/7. There are people there. James and myself have worked the help desk for years, and luckily we don't have to do that anymore. Or sometimes I miss it.
I still get pulled in every now and then.
Yeah, well, exactly. I get away from it as far as I can.
It is manned 24/7 by real humans.
That's right.
It's not robots. It's live support all the time.
Yep. So it's very nice. If you have any questions about, hey, I can't see shared labs, I want to be able to check this feature out, just contact them. Tell them I sent you, and we will get you taken care of. And with that, I want to send out a big thank you for watching our Shared Labs feature focus, and talk about or mention that you should stay tuned because we have lots and lots of good content coming up for the rest of Launch 2018. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.